Greetings, one and all, and welcome to the Infinite Journey podcast. I'm Paul James Caden, and on today's show, we are going to be discussing the mysterious Urantia book. If you're a listener that has tuned into my conversations during some of my older podcasts, you might remember that I touched on this topic once or twice in some of my older shows. But we do have some new people that are finding their way to the Infinite Journey. And perhaps some of you are listening right now asking the question, what the heck is the Urantia book? What is this guy talking about? Well, we're going to get into all that in just a few moments because this is a topic that bears revisiting, re-talking about. And this is a podcast that will and does discuss spirituality and philosophy from the viewpoint of the Urantia book. So it is important that folks know what that is when I refer to it and speak about it in these podcasts. But just for a little bit of a spoiler here, the Urantia book is said to be a revelation or an angelic communication that was given by celestial beings. The compilation and writing of the Urantia book started in 1911, and some historians say maybe a little bit earlier than that, but the book was actually published in 1955. But the Urantia book has a very mysterious origin story, and no one really knows where this book came from. A lot of mystery around it, a lot of unanswered questions, and the story of the Urantia book itself is really quite fascinating. But before we get into the history and the story of the Urantia book, I would like to tell a little bit about my journey or my discovery of this book, because everyone who reads or studies the Urantia book has their story of how they came across it. And many people say that they feel it was God that led them to the Urantia book, or they were guided to read it by their guardian angels, because when they started reading it, it just had this incredible wow factor. And it answered so many questions for them and just opened their eyes. And it was just what they needed on their spiritual journey at that moment. So I thought I would take the opportunity in this show to talk about how I came to read the Urantia book. And I suppose my story starts back in 1995, maybe 96. I remember back in those days, I used to go to the bookstore every weekend. And there was a Barnes and Noble about an hour away from me. It was in Poughkeepsie, New York, in Dutchess County. And it had this huge spiritual philosophy section. And those were the books that I've always read. So the bigger the spiritual section, the better. And I remember going there every weekend, and I always saw on the bottom shelf of the spirituality section this huge volume, and it had a blue cover with golden letters on it that said the Urantia book. And it had a little logo on it that looked like a bullseye. Now, I'd never heard of the Urantia book before in my life. So when I saw it, I thought it was the Urantia book because it's spelled Urantia. I'd never heard it pronounced. I never heard about it. So I was like, okay, what is this Urantia book? It's huge. And the cover, it wasn't paperback or hardcover. The cover of this book was this really weird, flexible, bendy, kind of plastic material. And I would always pick this book up when I saw it, and I would flip through it because I would always go through the spiritual section, take all the books off that I was going to consider buying, go sit on one of the benches in the Barnes and Noble, and sort through all of the books. I'm going to buy this one now, save this one for next week, this one for the week after if nothing better comes out by then. And I would always pick up the Urantia book and I would skim through it. And I read bits and pieces of it, and it talked about this greater spiritual universe inhabited by all of these spiritual or celestial beings. It talked about the nature of God. It talked about the lost teachings and history of Jesus. And I didn't read a lot of it. Some of the language was a little thick. But I can't say when I skimmed through it that it struck me as something as, oh, this is a lot of nonsense. It kind of resonated. But I was very hesitant to buy this gigantic volume, even though it was only $10 or $15. It wasn't that much money. But I didn't know what it was. What was this Urantia book? Was it something that was put out by a religious group or a cult trying to get followers through their literature? And I just wasn't interested in that kind of thing. But as the years went on, I would reflect back on this strange blue book that I saw in the Barnes and Noble. And I think once upon a time when I finally got the courage to maybe buy it and read through it, what's the worst that could happen? It wasn't there. And then over time, I just forgot about the book, even though there were times I would reflect on some of the snippets that I read in its pages. Now, if we fast forward to the summer of 2017, I was watching quite a bit of YouTube at that particular time, and I liked some of the spiritual content on there. And I remember one day going to YouTube. I have a Roku box, so I get YouTube on my TV, which is great. But in my YouTube video recommendations were these videos about the Urantia book. I recognized the title, that strange title, the Urantia book. So I thought to myself, oh, there's that book that I used to look at in the Barnes and Noble. I'm going to watch some of these videos and see exactly what this is. I kind of had the notion it was something from like a New Age cult group. But to my surprise, it wasn't. It had this whole history where the book came from, what was contained in the book, what the purpose of the book was, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so I found probably about midsummer to summer's end reading about things concerning the Urantia book online, watching some of the videos, and probably around September, October, it just fell to the wayside. I got occupied with other things. And then one day in early December of that year, I was working and I worked from home. I was in my office that I had set up there, and I'd gone to the bathroom. And as I was coming back to go back to work, suddenly I just heard one of those voices that we all get in our heads every now and then that gives us a directive. And I heard this voice in my head say, it's time to read the Urantia book. And I remember I paused for a minute in the hallway and thought, okay, that's interesting. I'll have to look into this. So I went back to work, and it probably took me a couple of days to look the book up online, saw that it was still in print, found a copy on Barnes and Noble, and ordered it. And it came in probably about a week later, and I started reading it. And like a lot of other people who read the Urantia book, it kind of had this wow factor and a bit of a whoa factor for me. Because when I was very young, and I've been a spiritual person all my life since I was literally a little kid, spirituality isn't second nature to me. It's like first nature. It's just always been who I am as long as I can remember. And as I got older into my teens, 20s, 30s, I would ponder all these things about the nature of God, the nature of the universe, What is life after death? What is the human soul? And I would come up with these ideas that I never heard anyone talk about. I never heard anyone theorize about these things. And I would talk to family members and friends about some of these things I was thinking about every once in a while. But I really wouldn't get much feedback because I think it was way outside their religious and theological comfort zone. But here I was reading the Urantia book in 2017 and seeing these ideas that I used to think about in this book. Never heard a preacher talk about it, never a priest, never a minister, never a lecture, never read it in a book, but here it all was in the Urantia book. So I definitely had that moment like, wow, this is really odd in a very cool sort of way. And so the rest is history. I began to read it. I began to study it. I began to look at the history of the Urantia book to find out as much as I could about it. And I'm still in that process of doing that. I haven't finished reading all of the papers in the Urantia book because it is a very thick volume. And some of the papers I've gone back and reread 2 or 3 times just to absorb what it is that they're saying because some of the language is a little thick and you really have to concentrate to understand what it's saying. But a lot of people do have trouble with some of the papers. Others are in a more fluid, easy to understand language, but it's all very much worth the read, I think. But where does this book come from? Is it an angelic communication? Did it come from celestial beings? Some people say no. Some people say that it's a fraud written by a psychiatrist who lived in Chicago in the early 1900s by the name of William Sadler. He and some friends concocted this whole story. They wrote the book. It's nothing but a fraud. But there's a lot of problems with the concept of it being a fraud and William Sadler and his friends making all of this up. Because William Sadler, when you look into his past, seemed to be a pretty stand up and well respected man in his community. He was a psychiatrist. He taught in the university. He was a professor. He done very well for himself in his career. He was not a poor man or a struggling man. He was pretty well to do, very well respected, and he was also someone who debunked a lot of psychic and spiritualist activity. He actually wrote a book entitled The Mind and Its Mischief. And this entire book was debunking psychic and spiritualist activity. And Sadler's belief was that any such activity that even looked convincing was either something psychological or something coming out of the subconscious mind where the individual believed they were making contact or getting information from higher powers in the universe. So he didn't believe any of this stuff. And another interesting thing about it is that no one made any money from the Urantia book. Not a penny. Not William Sadler, not anyone else that he knew that was involved in compiling these papers. But how did William Sadler come in contact with the Urantia book, and who were these other people around him at the time? Well, the story is that in 1911, William Sadler and his wife were living in a temporary residence in Chicago, and they were waiting for some last minute preparations to be done on a new home that they were about to move into. And one evening, a knock comes to their door, and there's a woman, one of their neighbors, who asks if the Sadlers could come downstairs and check her husband. Something was wrong with him. He was in this deep sleep, and she couldn't wake him up. Now, the history of the Urantia book, those who really dig into this believe that this woman was a patient of Dr. Sadler's wife because she too was a doctor. So they believe that she was under Mrs. Sadler's care, and this is how she knew they were doctors and where to go uh, when her husband was having an issue. So the Sadlers went downstairs, and it says William Sadler checked out this man, tried to wake him up, shined lights in his eyes, pricked him with pins, loud noises, tried to arouse him, couldn't wake this gentleman up. He eventually woke up on his own and asked, "Well, what is everybody doing here? Why is everyone in my room? Why are these people in our apartment in this time of night?" So Dr. Sadler asks the gentleman to come into his office the next day and have a full examination, which he does. So this gentleman undergoes a full medical examination. He's given a clean bill of health, but Dr. Sadler is interested in his case, trying to figure out why he goes into this deep sleep state and why he can't be awoken from it. So it is said eventually that the man one night was in this deep sleep state and he begins to speak. And it was a voice that was not his normal speaking voice. And the voice introduces itself as a celestial being from a far off galaxy who is on a journey of exploration through the cosmos. And all of this begins a very interesting dialogue between the supposed celestial visitors speaking through this sleeping subject, as he was called, who never wanted to be named. He told Dr. Sadler as long as he is alive, he'd rather not anybody ever know his name. He doesn't want any part of what's going on. He was very indifferent to these messages that were coming through him while he slept. That's what the people around him said. He just really seemed disinterested and didn't care one way or another about it. But eventually, Dr. Sadler puts together this forum of individuals to discuss some of the things that are being said during this man's sleeping sessions. Other doctors are called in to examine the sleeping subject. Dr. Sadler talks to other psychologists and psychiatrists, and everyone seems to have trouble pinpointing exactly what is going on with this man, and Dr. Sadler believes it somehow is a fraud. Especially when the voice speaks through the sleeping man one night and Dr. Sadler asks, "Who are you and where are you from?" And the voice replies, "If you knew who you were speaking to, you would ask more important questions than this." And then the voice was just gone. It stopped speaking. So Dr. Sadler got together with his forum, with his group, and they wrote down, it was over 100 questions, that the next time the man started speaking in these voices, Dr. Sadler was going to ask him these very in-depth questions, which would be kind of difficult, as I gather, for even a theologian to answer, because they were questions about the universe, questions about God. But the voices would come through at random times, so Dr. Sadler never knew when he would have opportunity to ask these questions. Now, it's said that the sleeping subject and his wife didn't know about these questions that Dr. Sadler and the group had written down. Dr. Sadler wanted to spring these questions on the man when he was supposedly speaking in the voice of these celestial visitors. But lo and behold, one night, I believe they say it was around 3 in the morning, a knock comes to the door. It's the wife of the sleeping subject. Asks Dr. Sadler and his wife, "Come downstairs quickly. Something has happened. I don't understand this." They go downstairs, and the wife of the sleeping subject hands Dr. Sadler this 500-page handwritten in pencil volume. And she says, I don't know where this came from. It just kind of appeared on my husband's desk in his study. I didn't write it. He didn't write it. We don't know what this is. So Dr. Sadler naturally thought, okay, he's going to find out now that this is nothing but a hoax. This man or his wife wrote this very thick 500-page volume, and now they're going to try to pass it off as something psychic or spiritual. But as Dr. Sadler began to read the 500 pages, he says to his surprise, those over 100 questions that he and the forum members came up with were answered in that manuscript. And now remember, the sleeping subject and the sleeping subject's wife did not know about these questions, didn't know what they were, didn't even know they existed. But yet here they were, answered in this manuscript. So this greatly puzzled Dr. Sadler, and the manuscripts kept appearing. And so inevitably, Dr. Sadler got 3 handwriting analysis experts who checked the handwriting of the sleeping subject's wife, against the manuscripts, and none of them matched. They were all different. And Dr. Sadler also said that once the manuscripts were typed, because they typed them out, and I'll get into why they were typing them out in just a moment. But once the manuscripts were typed out, the original handwritten manuscripts would disappear. And Dr. Sadler kept them in a safe. They disappeared. He thought somebody was taking them. He put $10 bills in between some of the pages of the manuscript. The manuscript was gone. The money was still there. He rented out a bank safe and a box in the bank. He needed the banker, someone in the bank, to bring the key, open it up, and hand him the manuscript. When he went, the original manuscripts were gone. And someone in the bank accused him of playing shenanigans, of somehow coming in the bank, getting the key, taking the manuscript, which, that would be kind of a feat, I suppose. But this is how the Urantia book was supposedly originated. They were mysterious manuscripts that came out of nowhere, allegedly written by celestial beings, and somehow materialized into our reality. As the plot thickened with all of this, eventually the sleeping subject was no longer needed, and Dr. Sadler put together what was called the Contact Commission, and they would go, and I don't know if they went to the sleeping subject's house or whether it was somewhere else that they went, but they said that these celestial beings communicated with them one-on-one. They didn't see anything, but they heard the disembodied voices speaking to them about the manuscripts, speaking to them about things that were in the manuscripts, telling them what the purpose of these revelations were. And the whole purpose was to be these papers were manifested into our world, written by these celestial beings. And they instructed Dr. Sadler and his forum team to read through them, type them out, and eventually, after so many papers were given, they wanted the book published because it was to be a revelation to humanity to help him on his next leg of his spiritual evolution. Now, the celestial beings allegedly told the Contact Commission they wanted no human being's name on the book. They didn't want someone to be made into a new prophet. whether it be a Moses or a Jesus or a Buddha or a Muhammad or whoever. The celestial beings said they wanted the revelation to stand on its own and not draw attention to any individual. And this was not to be a book that was to start a religion or a church or a movement. It was a book for the individual to bring mankind back to fellowship, communion, and faith in the one true God. There are papers in the Urantia book that talk about some of the problems and fallacies of our religious organizations and their doctrines and dogmas and human philosophies that crept into our religions that made things difficult, or seeing God through a lens that is not necessarily accurate. So it was to be a book and a revelation for the every person, not a group with a priest or a pastor or a head of the group who tells everyone what to believe or how to disseminate the Urantia book, because the Urantia book is very big on your individual relationship and experience with God is the most important thing. Because when you experience God for yourself, within yourself, then you know that He is a very real and loving presence in your life and in the universe. So the personal relationship and experience is first and foremost in the Urantia book. But eventually, the book was published in 1955. Dr. Sadler and the members of his forum raised the money, put the money together, took the book to print themselves. They paid for it. They wanted no money, no income for book sales. It was just simply, this celestial revelation is done, it's finished, it's printed, it's ready for people to read and just take it in for themselves. And the Urantia book, the history of the book says that they were very excited when the first copies of the book rolled off of the printing press, but they were very disappointed that the people of the day, particularly the religious community, snubbed it and said, "Oh, so you guys tried to write another Bible? Well, that's great. We already have one," which you could see that would probably be the attitude of many religious people back then and even today. But it made its way into the hands of some people who were really taken with the book. And there was a judge in one particular town in Chicago who gave a copy of the book to a friend of his who was a pastor. And this pastor was so taken with the Urantia book that he started researching on his own where it came from. He even contacted Dr. Sadler, who was still alive. He was in his early or mid 70s at that time. And the man went to Chicago, uh, interviewed Dr. Sadler, ended up becoming, very good friends with him throughout the rest of his life. So he heard stories. He talked to some of the people who were still alive that were on the forum. There were all kinds of bits and pieces of conversations and pieces of letters and stories and recollections. And Dr. Sadler stuck to his guns that he has no idea how these papers came into being. It was hypothesized by Dr. Sadler's son, William Sadler Jr., that he had this theory of how the papers were written and how they came into being, and that through this whole process, if you were to look at the papers being created, you would see a pencil moving with no one actually moving it because the being would be invisible, but moving very quickly across the page and writing out the manuscript. But Dr. Sadler, up until his death, said that this was a mystery to him, and he even mentioned in his book that we talked about earlier, The Mind and Its Mischief, that all of the psychic and spiritualist activity that he encountered, he was able to debunk or prove that it came from the subconscious mind or other psychological phenomenon. But he made note to say, except for this one that I first encountered in 1911, which was the sleeping subject. And he had some notes in the back of the book about the sleeping subject and how this was very puzzling and was an ongoing thing of research for Dr. Sadler to put this mystery together. Now, he was a believer in the papers. He was a believer in the revelation. He believed that these manuscripts came from celestial beings. His wife, who died, I believe, of breast cancer in 1939, was a staunch believer in the Urantia papers. She was part of the Contact Commission, and she went to her grave believing in, with all her heart, that these revelations were authentic and this experience was absolutely real, that they were all a part of. There is a lot to the history of the Urantia papers, and I'm just kind of glazing over some of the details here and getting to the crux of the matter, that they were said to be a communication by angels or celestial beings. This revelation came in kind of a miraculous way. But if you want to dig more into this, there is a very good book entitled A History of the Urantia Papers by Larry Mullins. And this book it's a great read because there are two histories to the Urantia Papers, History 1 and History 2. History 2 is the more problematic. We don't necessarily believe that this was any kind of special communication from beyond or from cosmic beings. But yet History 2 backs up a lot of the facts of History 1. What was said, what happened, who did what, who said what, and all of these different little facts. So, A History of the Urantia Papers by Larry Mullins takes an in-depth look at the history of this book, and it doesn't pull any punches when it talks about things being problematic or confusing or unknown, but it paints a very vivid picture, and it contains copies of old letters and handwritten notes, pictures of Dr. Sadler, people that were in the forum, stories that they told as they got older, stories they told during their experience with the revelation. So it's a very good book, a very interesting and compelling read. So if you really want to dig into a good history of the Urantia book, A History of the Urantia Papers by Larry Mullins is a great read. The hardcover seems like it's a little bit hard to find. I found one um, in like new condition on Amazon for a pretty decent price. But some people were asking a pretty penny for just an acceptable copy. So if you can't find the hardback or the paperback in decent condition for a decent price, I think it wasn't very much. It was no more than $8.99, but I think it was less than that. I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of $4.99 on ebook. I found it in the Amazon Kindle ebook store. So if you can't find a hard copy, it's there on Amazon Kindle. Well worth the read. So again, the Urantia book was to be the everyman's book, a revelation filling in the gaps about the history of our world, the universe, the nature of God, the nature of life after death. If there's a question that you would want to ask about the universe or God or angels or the afterlife, Jesus, Adam and Eve, Melchizedek, I mean, so many questions. Any question you'd want to ask is probably answered in the Urantia book. And again, if this was a hoax, why did no one make any money off of it? Why was it put out just to stand on its own merits? Because that is what Dr. Sadler and the Forum wanted. That's what the celestial beings allegedly wanted and told the Forum members that they wanted. And the Forum members, including Dr. Sadler, were forbidden by the celestial beings to even write a foreword to the book. Although later on, Bill Sadler Jr. was allowed to write the table of contents. But other than that, there is no allegedly anything penned or written by a human being on this earth in this particular book. And the celestial beings also allegedly said they don't want this to be a book that people look at and say, "Oh wow, it's this supernatural heaven sent revelation." It was communicated by these beings allegedly that, just as I said earlier, they want the revelation, they want the book to stand on its own merits. Read it, study it, see if it resonates, make up your own mind if this is authentic or if this is some kind of hoax and a lot of hooey. But the wonderful thing about the Urantia book, it's not like a Bible or some other holy book where if you read it and you don't agree with it or it just doesn't resonate, oh, you're in trouble with God. You know, that's not the point of the book at all. The Urantia book says the greatest thing you can do is just love God, seek to better yourself, evolve your own soul, and be a loving, compassionate, sincere person, and just have faith in God. If you're doing that, you're doing all that's required. So it's not a book that threatens you that if you do not believe this revelation, something bad is going to happen or you're going to go to hell or be displeasing to God. There's none of that in there. And I think that's one of the things people appreciate about it is that it's very freeing from condemnation and old condemning doctrines and dogmas. Yet in its delivery and its philosophy, it seems to make a lot of sense about a lot of things. I would say it is certainly a book that is worth reading. If you don't want to spend the money to buy a copy, you can read it online on PDF. Just put in free reading of the Urantia book PDF online, and there are several sites that make this available to anyone who wants to read it. And then if you wanted to dig into the history of the book later, there are some good videos on YouTube. You could read A History of the Urantia Papers by Larry Mullins. There's some good stuff out there to dig into. And you could see if you're one of the people that reads the Urantia book and has that holy cow moment, like it does with a lot of other people. And this was something that Dr. Sadler said he encountered right away, that when these manuscripts were being materialized and they were typing them out, that he handed a copy of some of the manuscripts to friends of his that were scholars and theologians and historians and asked them to read the papers. Was it theologically sound? What did they think about all of this? And he said most of them came back to him, and the idea of them reading it and giving the theological kind of critique on it was almost lost because they would come and say, what is this? Where did you get this? This makes the most sense of anything I've ever read. One gentleman said, if this is not the truth, it should be. So people were very impressed and taken back by the things that were in these papers. And it still has that effect on many, many people today when they discover the Urantia book. So for me, uh, at the moment, unless proven otherwise, I think that this certainly has some higher origins in its making. And if you read it, I think you'll see and understand what I and a lot of other people are talking about when we say that. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope you got something out of this podcast today, as usual. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, be good to one another, and maybe read a little bit of the Urantia book. It just might bring a little bit of enlightenment to your day. I'll see you next time here on the Infinite Journey.